What's up creators, I hope you're doing well. Welcome back to my channel. I'm Tony Fuentes. Today we're returning to the Edit series and we're going to continue with the analog styles. In this case, black and white photography from Ilford. Now this video was suggested by one of you guys in the previous video, so if you have any styles that we're going to break down, whether it be photographers, Instagram profiles, YouTubers, movies, or even film stocks like today, put it down in the comment section and I'll check them out. Now in the original comment, Marco suggested the Ilford HP5. However, this being black and white photography, really it's a very simple and straightforward edit. So in order for this video not to be ridiculously short, we're gonna add, apart from the HP5, the SFX200 and the OrthoPlus. So we're gonna analyze three styles from Ilford. So let's jump into it. Okay, replicating the Ilford HP5 in Lightroom. Now before we jump into the editing software and create a preset, first of all let's talk about the main characteristics of this film. Now the Ilford HP5 main characteristic is that it has a low contrast if you compare it to other film stocks. You can see that there's loads of information in the shadows, loads of information in the highlights, and therefore we're losing a bit of strength in the whites and also in the blacks on our image. The blacks are completely grayed out, and the whites, well, we're not going to have any overexposed parts or pure whites on our image. Now this is creating a very flat exposure. Now apart from that, there's not much to say. It is black and white photography, so we're not gonna go into detail in colors, but we do have a very nice grain in the background. You can see it in particular in the whites. It's not very distracting, it's not very big, but it is there. So we have to keep that in mind when we jump into the effects tab in Lightroom. Okay, so we have all the information that we need. Now let's jump into Lightroom and start calibrating. Okay creators, so here I am in Lightroom. I've selected an image and moved into the develop tab. Now for this tutorial, I'm using Lightroom Classic, but don't worry if you use other versions of Lightroom, whether it be the mobile or the desktop version, is exactly the same process with the same tools, only that they look a bit different. Okay, so the first thing that we need to do is change this image into black and white. Now the straightforward thing to do is just move the saturation slider all the way to -100, and there we're stripping away all the colors. However, this isn't how I like to work. I like to use the profiles within Lightroom to change our entire setting into black and white. So you can go up here into Profile, Adobe Color, just click. I'm going to move down to Adobe Monochrome. You can also select V on your keyboard and you can transition into this profile. Now what happens right here, our image is transformed into black and white, but also notice how some of the tools have changed their aspect. For example, vibrance and saturation, we cannot move them because, well, there's no colors. And down here where we have the color mixer with the HSL, now we don't have the hue or the saturation sliders. We only left with the luminance in the colors. So now we have our tools set for editing black and white. Okay, so let's obtain that flat exposure that the Ilford HP5 has. Now the first tools that we have over here, temperature, tint, exposure, and contrast. These four general sliders, I like to leave them at 0 and not include them in the preset when we're saving it. So these are the values that I use to compensate maybe if my image is underexposed or overexposed or white balance is off on field. So these four, I like to leave them at 0. For example, right here, you can see that I added 0.35 stops of exposure because this image originally was a bit underexposed. But I do not want this 0.35 to be applied into other photos. So that's why I'm not including exposure and contrast into the preset. So instead, we're gonna move down to highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. These are called the basic correction tools. So right here, you can see that the highlights, we're losing a lot of information over here in the background. Notice what happens if I drag it towards the negatives. You can see how more information starts to appear as I move further down the slider. Now, of course, we do not want to go to the -100. This is completely unrealistic. We're losing a lot of the natural contrast of the image. So I'm gonna go maybe halfway to the -50. Then the shadows, we're not going to go down, otherwise we'll lose detail in the dark parts of the image. We can basically see nothing over here. We want to go towards the positives, so more information is creeping into the shadow. So I'm going to go with a value around the 69, and as you can see, immediately we have a lot more information in the dark parts of the image compared to our original photo. Whites and blacks, I'm just going to leave them like that. And remember that exposure and contrast within Lightroom is mainly composed by the basic corrections, but also the presence tab over here and the tone curve that we have over here. All these three tools affect our exposure and contrast. Okay, we're gonna skip the presence tab for the time being and move down to the tone curve. Now, the tone curve is a very powerful tool that allows us to control the exposure and contrast on our image to create certain looks. It allows us to correct our image as well, and we can even use it to color grade. So for example, if we wanted to add an indigo black and white, we can always go to the blue channel over here, create a point in the middle and just drag it towards the positives. And notice how we're adding this blue shift into our image. Opposite to that, if you want to add a sepia black and white, you can go towards the negatives. So as you can see, we can even play around with some colors when we're editing black and white with the RGB channels. Now for this tutorial, we're not going to use this. It was just a fun fact. I'm just going to reset this channel I'm going to move to the point tone curve over here. Now what I'm interested in doing right here is creating a bit more contrast in the lower parts on our image, not throughout the whole range of the shadows, and also fading out those blacks. Remember that we saw that the blacks were completely raised and very grayed out, they're not very punchy. So I'm just going to create a point here in the dark points of the shadows, one higher up, and this one I'm just going to drag it just below the diagonal just a bit, and the input is going to be 65, which is the coordinates in the x-axis, and the output is the vertical axis, is just 60. So those are the coordinates if you want to introduce them manually with your numeric keyboard. Now this point over here, I'm just going to drag it below the diagonal as well, just to add a bit more punch into the darkest points on our image, with a value of 28 and 25 in the output. Now this point over here, this one will control the deepest points on our exposure, the blacks. So what I'm interested in doing is putting it up, and as you can see, if I put it up, now the blacks are more grayed out. You can see the difference with the original image, how our blacks are in the grayish tones. Now this is way too much, of course, maybe a value around the 10, maybe 12% is just going to be enough. You can basically see the difference with the black interface of Lightroom. Here we have blacks, and now we have them a bit grayed out, nothing too unnatural. So that's it for the tone curve. Now move up to the presence tab. Now, if you want an in-depth tutorial about the tone curve, link up here to a dedicated video that I did a couple of years ago. Now the presence tab that we have over here, I also like to call it the effects tab, because we have texture that, well, adds or reduces the texture on our image. As you can see, if I zoom in, you can add more texture or take it away, making your image a bit blunt. Clarity that adds contrast into midtones, so it creates a very dramatic image or a very soft image. And then we have dehaze that, well, reduces the haze on our image or adds a simulated effect of mist. So what I'm interested in doing right here in the presence tab is just reducing a bit of the qualities that this digital image has. This image was shot with a 33 megapixel sensor in a very fast telephoto lens. So that's why we have a tad sharp image, way too sharp to be considered film photography. And back in the day, the lenses weren't as sharp, they weren't as contrasty, and they didn't have the coatings that lenses have right now to reduce glaring. So what I'm going to do is just try to mimic a bit of the effects of the old cameras. So what I'm going to do, first of all, texture, I'm just going to reduce it, not towards the -100, this is ridiculous, but just reduce it just a bit around the -25s. The clarity, I'm just going to do the same just to make the image a tad less contrasty in the details. And then the haze towards the negatives would add this simulated mist effect around highlights, similar to the halation effect. So as you can see towards the negatives, notice how our image completely washes out. So this is too much, but maybe around the -20, -18 is just gonna be enough. So these are the values that I'm gonna use, guys. Just a reminder that you don't have to go with the exact values that I selected over here. You can maybe play around, maybe you want a lighter effect or you want the contrast back, you just reset the values on the presence tab. Now, one thing is missing is all the way down in the effects tab, we have grain. Now, of course, the grain was quite small, but it was there. So I'm just gonna zoom in just a bit to see what we were looking at, and we have a very nice and fine noise right here, which isn't enough. So I'm just going to add some quantity in the grain or amount, not too much, maybe around the 20%. Now we can see it, but we're zoomed in. If you zoom out, it's not very noticeable. So I'm just going to change the size just a bit, maybe around the 40s, and then we have a very nice size, and we can basically observe it if we zoom out, but it's not too distracting. I think we did quite a good job. So this is the before and after. This is our original image. And now we have a very flat exposure with loads of information in the shadows, loads of information in the highlights, and the simulated film look effect. So let's save the preset and briefly just check out how it performs in a couple of other images to see if it works or if we need to modify it. Now to save a preset, we're going to go to the left panel over here. On the preset, select the plus sign, create a preset, and right here, we want to name it and only mark all the tools that we used. So for example, we didn't use white balance, exposure, and contrast. We didn't use detail over here. We didn't use color grading. We didn't use lens correction or transform. So we're not gonna mark them. So let's test it out in this image of this man in the gondola in Venice. So let's apply the preset HP5, and there we have our difference. Notice how we had a very contrasty image, and right here we have a bit more information in the shadows, not too much, not completely flat, but it's very nice. Also the highlights are a lot more preserved, we don't have any overexposure, and we have a very nice film grain. I think we did quite a good job. So right here we have this image of my dogs in the forest, and right here I have the Ilford HP5 applied. As you can see, I've added it into the Light Preset Pack V3 and the Analog Preset Pack. But this is the image, the final result. What happens if I reduce the amount to a -100? This is our black and white photography straight converted from this image. And as you can see, it's very punchy, very contrasty, and we're losing some detail in the highlights, but also some detail in the shadows. But once we apply the preset to its default value, you can notice how the image is very flat compared to the original. We're having a lot more information in the shadows, and the highlights are very well preserved. So there you have the Ilford HP5 applied into digital photography. Now, if you want to check out the analog preset pack that contains this preset, link up here if you want to check it out, and also the analog preset pack that contains all the analog styles or film looks that we've analyzed throughout the years. So if you can support me in that manner, I'll be very thankful. Okay, creating the Ilford SFX preset in Lightroom. Now, before we jump into Lightroom and start color grading and creating the preset, let's go over the general characteristics of this film stock. Now, the main aspects of the SFX200 is that we have a very dramatic contrast. Notice how the blacks are very deep and very rich, very strong blacks. We can't say the same with the highlights. The highlights are not too well preserved. We're losing some information because they're very bright in comparison to other film stocks. Now, one thing that's really catching my eye about this film stock is that it has a very nice grain. It's very big, very rough, but I like it. It gives a lot of texture and a lot of emotions into the image. Apart from that, I don't think there's much to add, except that this film stock has high sensitivity towards the oranges and the reds. What I mean by this is that it's going to be very receptive to light coming from that wavelength. Therefore, reds, oranges in our images are going to be a lot brighter. So you have to keep that in mind to add it in post-edition. So creators, once in Lightroom, I've selected an image and I moved into the Develop tab. As you can see over here, I'm in the Develop. Now we're going to start off by changing this image into black and white. And we can do this in several manners. We can obviously use the vibrance or the saturation sliders over here towards the -100, and we basically strip away all the colors. Or in my case, I like to use the profiles within Lightroom. So over here, you can select from Adobe Standard into Adobe Monochrome. You can also switch back to color by selecting V on your keyboard. As you can see, V, changing into Adobe Standard, V again into Adobe Monochrome. Now what happens right here is that some tools are changed depending on the profile that you're using. For example, right here we're in Adobe Monochrome, so vibrance and saturation are basically nullified. We cannot use them because there's no colors. And down here, black and white, well, is replacing the color mixer with HSL. So we can't change the hue or saturation of tones. We can only change the luminance. So just as a reminder, we want a very harsh contrast. So highlights, we don't want them to be very well preserved. So we don't want to go towards the negatives where we're retaining more information in the bright parts of the image. Notice how more of the islands in the background start to appear if I reduce the highlights. If I bring them towards the positives, they start to fade away and we're losing some information. So in this case, I'm not going to go all the way to the extremes, but towards the positives is the way that we want to go. So have brighter highlights. Then the shadows, I'm just going to go a bit towards the positives just to bring back a little bit more information in the dark parts of the image. Not too much. Remember, we are going to crush them just a bit in the future. Then white, I'm not going to move them, but blacks, this is the point that we want to make those rich and contrasty blacks. So we want to draw them not towards the positives, but towards the negatives. Notice how if I go more towards the negatives, the image becomes very contrasty, very dramatic. This is way too much. Maybe around the 50s is just going to be enough. 52 is the value that I selected over here. Immediately you can notice the difference. We have a very punchy and dramatic image. Next, we have the Presence tab. In here, we have the sliders of texture, clarity, and the haze, which are, I like to call them effects, but they also alter the exposure and contrast on our image. That's why they're right here next to our basic corrections. Now, as the name says, texture, well, it adds more texture into our image, or it reduces it, making our image a lot more soft. Clarity adds more contrast into details, into middle tones. So as you can see towards the positives, our image becomes highly dramatic, and towards the negatives, it becomes a bit more flat. And the haze, well, it does what it says. It reduces the haze, or it adds it in a very synthetic manner. So as you can see towards the positives, the mountains in the background start to appear because we're drawing the haze away. Towards the negatives, what we're adding is the simulated hazy effect, very similar to the halation effect in old cameras. So what I'm interested in doing right here is just simulate a bit of the imperfections of old lenses. Right now, this image was shot with a very contemporary lens, a Sony 35 G Master at 1/8000 of a second. So this image is highly sharp, nothing compared to old cameras like the ones that we have over here. Lenses in the old days didn't have the sharpest corners, the highest contrast, and they didn't have the coatings that we have right here to reduce glaring and imperfections in the light. So what I'm going to do is just try to replicate that just a bit. And what I'm going to do is just, first of all, texture towards the negative, just reducing a bit of the sharpness, clarity as well, a bit of the middle contrast that lenses have towards the negatives, around -25, both of them. And then haze, well, this is very personal, guys. You can not add it or you can add it. I'm just going to go a bit towards the negatives again, just around the -15 or -18, just to add this halation effect around our image. So it's a very stylized effect, and in particular the haze is reducing a bit of the contrast that we added. So you can always play around with these values, maybe reset them, and there you have a very punchy and dramatic image, or you can add them just to add a bit more of that analog effect. Now, another thing that's missing is the grain. So we're going to move down to the effects tab, and in the effects tab, we're just going to add that very big and robust grain that we saw. So first of all, we need to add some amount, because right here we do not have any grain. So just going to go towards the positives, maybe around the 30s. 34 is going to be the value. There we have very nice grain, but it's too small. So add some size. Just going to go ham with this around the 85, 86 is just going to be enough. And then we have a very big and robust grain that is just reducing a bit of the sharpness as well, but it's looking fantastic. Now, if you guys want it to be a bit more punchy and contrasty, you can always play around with the roughness. Roughness introduces more contrast into the different particles in the grain. So we have white particles, gray particles, and black particles. Roughness just adds more contrast, and as you can see, they become very apparent, or towards the negatives, just making them a bit more soft. In this case, I'm just going to leave it by default in 50. Now, one thing is missing to complete this preset, which is the sensitivity towards the reds and the oranges. And where we're going to do that is in the remnants of HSL or color mixer over here, which is right here called black and white, because we're in the black and white profile. So this is very straightforward. We want to add some luminance into the reds and also into the oranges. This will affect maybe the skin tone. So notice how if I move the red slider up and down, we're brightening and darkening the skin tones because they contain a lot of red. Even though we can't perceive the red because it's black and white photography, our image is capturing all the colors and changing them into black and white. So we want to change them towards the positives. Maybe around the 40% is just going to be enough, 48. And then the oranges as well are going to be highlighted. As you can see, they brighten and darken a lot of this image, again towards the positives, around, not too high, maybe around the 28. So this is what we're doing, is just replicating a bit of the qualities that this film stock has, that it has a lot of sensitivity towards the red tones and the oranges. And with Y in our keyboard, we can see what we did before and after. We have a very punchy and dramatic image compared to the original, and we have that very nice and dramatic film grain with that sensitivity towards the reds. Of course, you guys can play around with the presence tab. If you want it to be a bit more contrasty, just reset the values that we added over here. Now let's save the preset. We're going to go to the left panel over here, hit the plus sign, create a preset. And remember that right here, we do not want to mark anything that we didn't use. So for example, white balance, exposure, and contrast, we didn't use them, so we're not going to mark them. Okay, let's see how the preset performs in this image. In San Marcos Plaza, we have a lot of contrast because it's a very overcast day. So let's apply the preset SFX200, which is already in the LI preset pack. And there we have it, a very dramatic look compared to our original image, adding a bit more contrast, deep blacks, exactly what we were looking for. Of course, again, you guys can reset maybe the dehaze if you want it to be a bit more punchy. Dehaze just adds a bit more faded out effect into the image. Another one, here we have this image again in Venice, SFX200 from Ilford. And there we have it. Immediately you can notice how the highlights are raised just a bit more, a bit brighter, and the blacks are a bit more punchy and contrasty. Just as a comparison, let's see how it differs from the HP5 that we did in the previous video. So here we have it. The HP5 is a lot flatter. We have a flatter exposure. Those highlights are very well preserved, and also the shadows. And the SFX200 is a lot punchier and dramatic. So there you have my interpretation of the Ilford SFX200 into digital photography. Now, just as a reminder that the preset that we just created, I've already added it into the LI preset pack V3 and the analog preset pack. Link up here to both of them in case you want to check it out. Also, you can find over there my personal presets and personal LUTs that I use every single day to edit my content and speed up my editing process. So if you're interested in supporting me, I'll be very thankful. If not, like the video. Let's create a Lightroom preset for the Ilford OrthoPlus. Now, before we jump into the program and start color grading and creating a preset, first of all, let's talk about the general aspects of this film stock. Now, the main characteristic of the Ilford OrthoPlus is that it has a very dramatic contrast. Whites are very raised and very bright, and then the blacks are very deep and punchy looking. So in essence, what we're doing is just stretching our exposure to the extremes, creating a very contrasty image. Apart from that, the grain is barely noticeable, but it is there, very fine, very small. Now, one key aspect of this film stock is that it has high sensitivity for the greens and the blues. What I mean by this is that this film stock will capture a lot more light coming from those wavelengths. Therefore, greens in the forest, in the grass, blues in the sky are going to be a lot brighter. So it's great for landscape photography. Now, opposite to that, it's not great for portraiture because the reds and the oranges have low sensitivity, so they're going to be a lot darker, so it's not great for skin tones. So having said that, let's jump into Lightroom and start color grading. So creators, once in Lightroom, I have this image in the develop module, and as you can see, I'm in Lightroom Classic, but don't worry if you're editing on your phone or in your desktop version of Lightroom. It's exactly the same process, exactly the same tools, just the interface is a bit different. Now, first of all, we need to transform this image into black and white. And the way that I like to use it is using the profiles of Adobe over here. Right here, as you can see, we're in Adobe Color. Now I'm going to move down to Adobe Monochrome. And you can see immediately that our image is changed into black and white, and tools like vibrance and saturation are nullified. And in HSL, instead of having the hue and saturation sliders, right here we only have the luminance. Okay, so let's create that dramatic contrast. For that, we're going to use several tools. First of all, we're going to use the basic corrections over here, highlights, shadows, whites and blacks, then the tone curve, and also the presence tab. Now, as you can see, I did not mention the exposure contrast tools over here. Now, these two sliders, I like to leave them at 0, not include them in the preset, because maybe if my image was shot a bit underexposed on field or a bit overexposed, I can use these sliders to compensate. So right here, as you can see, this image, I added a 0.3 in the exposure because for my taste, it was a bit underexposed, but I do not want this 0.3 stops to be added into the preset and applied into all photos that maybe are taken in a correct manner. So these two, I like to exclude them from the preset, just as well as white balance and tint, which are not applicable for this tutorial because we're editing white photography. Okay, so first of all, we want to bring up a bit more information in the shadows. Around the 20s is going to be enough, plus 21. Now, I am adding a bit more information in the shadows because although it is a very contrasty style, it is still film photography that has loads of information and loads of latitude of exposure. Then the whites, I'm just going to bring them up. Remember, we want brighter highlights, brighter whites on the plus 26, just creating a bit more contrast. And then opposite to that, the blacks, I'm just going to drag it down to create that punchy look or those deep blacks in our image, around the minus 16. Okay, so immediately straight out from the box, you can notice how the image is a bit more dramatic, a bit more punchy in terms of contrast, but not quite finished. Let's move down to the tone curve. Now, the tone curve is a very powerful tool that allows us to control the exposure and contrast on our image, but also we can even add some colors. So for example, we're editing black and white photography, but we can still add some tints into our image with the RGB channels. Now, in this case, we're not going to use that, just going to move to the point tone curve over here. And it's a very simple edit. What we want to do is just make our exposure a bit more punchy and contrasty. For that, what we need to do is just add more difference between the dark parts of the image and the bright parts of the image. And the easiest way to do that is just alter or tilt our tone curve into a specific direction. So as you can see, if I go towards the positives or towards the left with our whites over here, we can add more white, more brightness into our image. Now, obviously this is way too much. Just going to drag it just a bit, and the value is going to be 244 in the input, which is the x-axis, and then 255, which is the vertical axis of this coordinate. And then this point over here controls the blacks. We don't want to go up, otherwise we introduce more brightness into the dark parts of the image. Instead, we want to go towards the right. And notice how we go towards the right, we're changing our exposure to be a bit more contrasty and punchy. Now, obviously, again, this is way too much. It's going to be very slight, very subtle, around the 10%, but immediately you can notice the difference. We just shifted our exposure to be a bit more harsh in terms of contrast. You can deactivate the tone curve. This is before and after, and it's very punchy and dramatic. With Y on our keyboard, you can see what we're doing, and we're getting there with the exposure and contrast. Next, we're going to move up to the presence tab. Now, just as a disclaimer, the presence tab in this case for this preset is going to be completely optional, up to you guys, but I am going to use it. Now, the presence tab, we have texture, clarity, and dehaze, which will affect how sharp and how contrasty our image looks. In particular, this image is shot in a digital sensor, a 33 megapixel sensor at 2.8 aperture and 1/2000 of a second. So it's tad sharp, as you can see, very sharp. And in the olden days, we could not achieve such a sharp image. The lenses back in the day were a bit softer, a bit less contrasty, and they didn't have all the coatings that lenses have today to create such a sharp and contrasty image. So what I like to do in the presence tab is just handicap a bit my image so it looks a bit older. So what I can do right here is just texture, for example, go towards the positives, we add more texture, more clarity. I'm going to go towards the negatives just to make it a bit softer, just a bit. And then clarity, well, it adds contrast into details, into midtones, so I don't want to go towards the positives. I want to go again towards the negatives, around the minus 24, same values. And then the haze, what it will add towards the negatives is a similar effect to the halation effect. Not exactly the similar, but quite similar. The highlights are going to start to glow if I go towards the negatives, as you can see, around the -18, just to make our image a bit more washed out. So you guys can go with these values, but as you can see, they altered a bit of the exposure and contrast on our image. In particular, the haze, if you deactivate the haze, it highly affects our contrast. So you guys can go with the value that you want over here or not include them at all. Next up, grain. Now the grain was very subtle, very small, but it was there. So what I'm going to do is just add some quantity over here, maybe around the 20s. It's just going to be enough. So it's not too distracting or not too big, and just add a bit of size. Around the 41 is going to be enough. And if we zoom out, we can basically neglect it. We don't see it at a first glance, but if we zoom in and pay attention, it's there, quite small, but it is there. Now, finally, let's add that sensitivity for landscapes and that lack of sensitivity for portraits. So we're going to move up to black and white, which is, well, the remnants of the HSL. And first of all, the reds and the oranges, we want to bring them towards the negative. So just reducing a bit of the sensitivity of these colors. Oranges are around a -29 and around a -25, or the same values for the reds. Immediately you can notice how it affects the reds in the tree over here. Notice how if I deactivate black and white, this is before and after we're making them a bit more dark, because this film stock isn't too sensitive to these colors. So we're basically darkening all the colors that are contain a bit of red or a bit of orange, as you can see. That includes also the pants, which are brown. And then we're going to add more sensitivity for the greens and for the blues. So up to the values around the +35, just going to do the same for the aquas that will control a bit of the blues, and also for the blues as well. And as you can see in our original image, we have some blues in the background in the shade and some greens. If I deactivate black and white, they're basically very dark, and now they're a lot brighter, a bit more sensitive to those colors. So this will make this preset perfect for landscape photography, but not great for portraits. So let's save the preset and see briefly how it performs in other images and see if we need to modify it. So I'm going to go to presets, hit the plus sign, create a preset, and we're going to name it. And just a reminder, we don't want to mark any of the things that we didn't use. For example, detail, calibration, high dynamic range, color grading, we didn't use them, just as white balance, exposure, and contrast. How about in this image, already a very contrasty image in the Zetas of Sevilla. Let's apply first of all over here the OrthoPlus, and it's very dramatic. Notice how the sky is completely lit up because of the sensitivity to the blues. And then we have a very nice contrast, very punchy looking and dramatic image. Then the SFX200, which is quite similar, but as you can see, we have deeper and darker blacks with a very nice and big film grain, but the highlights are a bit well preserved compared to the OrthoPlus. And then finally, we have the HP5, which is very flat. We have loads more detail in dark parts of the image and highlights, but we are losing some of the contrast or natural contrast of the image. How about in this image of these old guys playing some chess in New York? Let's apply the OrthoPlus and just pay attention to the blue in the jacket and the red in the sweater over here. So let's apply that. And yeah, we can see how the blues became brighter and the reds became darker. And that's because of the sensitivity to certain colors that we added in black and white, very similar to the film. Now, in the other hand, we have over here the SFX200 from Ilford as well, which is similar in the sense that we have a nice looking contrast, but right here we have highlights that are a bit more well preserved. Pay attention to the white chess pieces over here. This is in the SFX200, and in the OrthoPlus, they're a bit brighter, a bit well less preserved, a bit more dramatic. Now, on the other hand, we have over here the HP5, which is completely different. It's a very flat exposure over here with low contrast, but loads more information. So 3 different styles from the Ilford, and I think we nailed them all. And that makes it 3 for 3, 3 different looks based on the Ilford black and white film stocks. I hope you achieved some knowledge out of this video, and in particular, how to manage black and white photography within Lightroom. Now, just as a reminder, guys, these presets that we created today are in the Analog Preset Pack V3 and the Analog Preset Pack. Link up here if you want to check them out and support me. Also up there, you can find my personal presets and personal LUTs that I use every single day to edit all my contents, whether it be Instagram photos, client work, or my YouTube videos. They're all edited with presets and LUTs. And if you want to support me, I'll be very thankful. If not, just like the video, share it with a friend. Actually, sharing is quite important, guys. If you can, just share one of my videos in your Instagram stories or your social media. That really helps me out so I can continue to do videos for you guys in the future. So other than that, have a very nice day. I'm Tony Fuentes. Cheers to all of you, and I'll see you in the next one.